On January 14, 2026, the lights in a Shanghai clearing room didn't flicker. They didn't need to. A server rack hummed like a refrigerated morgue, and somewhere in that cold blue glow, a new line item appeared on a global ledger. The world will tell you this story is about politics, pride, and a revolt against Washington. That's the comforting myth, the clean headline, the kind of story that lets you blame flags and speeches. But it wasn't flags, it was math. It wasn't speeches, it was a balance sheet. They didn't challenge the dollar with tanks or tariffs. They challenged it with settlement rails, collateral, and an exit door marked bankruptcy avoidance. Because empires don't fall when they lose battles. They fall when the ledger says they're insolvent, when the costs compound faster than the cash arrives, when the world's trust becomes a liability on the wrong side of the balance sheet. And that January night, the BRICS bloc didn't declare war on the dollar. They quietly introduced competition. They didn't burn the old system down. They priced an alternative. They didn't start a revolution. They opened a second register. For most of your life, the dollar has been the receipt paper of planet Earth. Oil contracts, shipping insurance, aircraft leases, wheat futures, sovereign debt. It all ran through the same ink. You could be in Jakarta, Lagos, or Buenos Aires, and still the number that mattered was the one printed in US dollars. That wasn't just convenience, that was control. Now imagine what it means when a coalition flips the switch on a new unit of account. Not a flag-waving coin, not a speculative token, a settlement instrument designed for one job, moving value across borders without asking permission. The accountants call it reducing counterparty risk. The rest of us call it escape. We think the dollar's dominance is a natural law, like gravity. We think it sits on top of the world because it earned it, because America is strong, because markets are free, because the system is fair. But dominance is never moral. It's mechanical. It's infrastructure. It's habit. It's enforcement. The dollar didn't become king because everyone loved it. It became king because the world needed a standard, and the United States had the biggest vault, the biggest navy, and the deepest bond market. Bretton Woods in 1944 didn't just pick a currency. It selected a plumbing system. Pipes, valves, clearinghouses, correspondent banks. Once your country's trade ran through those pipes, leaving them felt like surgery without anesthesia. That is the part people miss. Reserve currencies aren't just about printing paper. They are about billing, about invoicing, about who gets to be the middleman on every major transaction. When you are the middleman, you skim the oxygen. You get the privilege. In the noir version of history, money isn't a tool. It's a weapon with a polite smile. And for 80 years, the weapon has been the same. A green slip of paper backed by the world's largest bond market and the threat of exclusion. The modern world runs on one unspoken sentence. If you want to trade, you will settle in dollars. BRICS looked at that sentence and wrote a counteroffer. At the peak of dollar majesty, the illusion was beautiful. Picture the global parade. Container ships stacked like steel mountains, oil tankers dragging black wealth across oceans, planes with cargo holds full of microchips and pharmaceuticals, and behind it all, invisible but absolute, the dollar clearing system. It was a golden procession you couldn't see, because the gold wasn't in bars anymore. It was in trust, it was in liquidity, it was in the fact that at 3 a.m., in any time zone, someone would take your dollars. That is power. When the world prices trade in your currency, you don't just sell paper. You sell stability. You sell the promise that your numbers will still mean something tomorrow. You sell a safe place to park reserves, like a hotel that never closes. And you get paid for it in ways most people never notice. Cheap borrowing, endless demand for your government bonds, the ability to run deficits that would suffocate other nations. The ability to sanction your enemies with a spreadsheet, not a soldier. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Not because the dollar was weak, because the temptation was too strong. When the world needs your paper, you start to believe the paper is the world. You start to spend like consequences are for other countries. You start to treat debt like background noise. That's when the ledger begins to whisper. Every empire has an addiction. Spain had silver. Britain had colonial trade routes. The United States has the privilege of issuing the world's invoice. And like every addiction, it feels like strength until the supply chain breaks. BRICS' story is not about a new currency. It's about an intervention. Here's the trap. When you settle global trade in one currency, everyone else needs that currency. They borrow it. They hold it. They build reserves of it. They price their commodities in it. And in doing so, they accept a quiet vulnerability. If your reserves sit inside someone else's system, your sovereignty has a password, and you don't control it. Debt is the monster in this story. Not the dramatic, roaring kind. The slow one. The one that sits on your chest at night and makes it hard to breathe. The one that whispers, "You will pay me first." In the BRICS worldview, the antagonist isn't a general. It's a gatekeeper. It's the clearing system. It's the compliance officer. It's the SWIFT message that never arrives. It's the correspondent bank that suddenly can't process the transaction. It's the market's raised eyebrow. The trigger wasn't philosophical. It was surgical. February 2022 was the moment the world learned the modern financial system has a kill switch. Western governments froze roughly $300 billion in Russian foreign reserves. Not a fine, not a tariff, not a warning, a freeze. Think about the scale of that. Hundreds of billions, accumulated over decades, rendered unusable with legal paperwork. That was the sound of a vault door closing from the outside, and every finance minister on earth heard it. If it can happen to a nuclear-armed G20 economy, it can happen to anyone. That is when the addiction became fear. That is when diversification stopped being a portfolio strategy and became a national security doctrine. The monster wasn't Russia. The monster was the realization that reserves held in dollars and euros are not truly yours. They are yours until they aren't. So BRICS started building a trapdoor. Not overnight, not loudly. In the way accountants do revolutions, committees, pilot programs, bilateral settlements, and quiet accumulation of collateral. You can see the footprints in gold buying. You can see it in talk of local currency trade. You can see it in the creation of parallel payment systems. These aren't headlines that trend. They are pipes being laid under the city while everyone watches fireworks above. Then, January 2026 arrived, and the pipes connected. In the BRICS narrative, the new instrument isn't a flag. It's a unit. That name matters. A unit sounds boring, clinical, like something from an engineer's desk, not a politician's rally. That's the point. Boring is credible. The selling pitch isn't romance. It's stability and sovereignty. That's the psychological product. Countries don't want your ideology. They want a settlement method that can't be seized. They want to invoice trade without importing someone else's geopolitics. So the system is designed like a hybrid animal, part anchor, part engine. In the myth, you'll hear numbers like 40% and 60%. You'll hear talk of gold backing as a credibility anchor. You'll hear talk of a basket of member currencies as the growth component. It's a clever structure because it answers the two most common fears. Will it hold value? And will it steal my sovereignty? Gold is the old language. 5,000 years of human panic distilled into metal. When trust breaks, people don't run to paper. They run to weight. That's why every central bank, even the ones that preach modernity, still keeps bars in vaults. Gold is insurance against politicians. The basket is the new language, a way to say, we are not one country's printing press, a way to distribute power and risk across multiple economies, a way to claim neutrality even when neutrality is a costume. This is the brilliance. The product isn't a currency for citizens buying coffee. It's a currency for states buying oil. It's for settling bulk trade, for shaving away dependence, for building a reserve tool that doesn't require kneeling. The world's ledger is changing, not because people want novelty, because they want leverage. Now watch the descent, because this is where the thriller begins. The timeline isn't a single explosion, it's a spiral. First, the sanctions era hardens. From 2014 onward, more countries begin treating the dollar system like a battlefield. Each new sanction is a reminder that access to payment rails is conditional. It's not yours by right, it's granted. Second, the pandemic years inflate everything. Governments print trillions. Supply chains snap like dry wood. Inflation returns like a ghost everyone swore was exorcised. Interest rates rise again, and suddenly the cost of dollar debt becomes a choke chain. Third, the reserve freeze in 2022 delivers the message in blood. It proves reserves can be immobilized. It proves the balance sheet can be weaponized. It proves that risk-free assets are only risk-free if you are politically aligned. The gold was hoarded. The credit was questioned. The allies recalculated. That is your rule of three. The gold was hoarded. The credit was questioned. The allies recalculated. And every repetition tightened the noose. By 2023 and 2024, more bilateral trade is settled outside the dollar. Not because the dollar vanishes, but because the cost of using it rises for certain players. When a country fears sanctions, every dollar transaction carries an invisible insurance premium. Compliance is not free. Banks don't like uncertainty. They like predictable rules. When rules become political, banks retreat. Trade adapts. Workarounds become normal. Oil gets priced in other currencies. Gas contracts get rewritten. Local swaps expand. Settlement becomes fragmented. Then come the numbers that change behavior. A country with $200 billion in reserves looks at Russia's frozen $300 billion and feels naked. A finance ministry that once held 70% of reserves in dollars decides maybe it should be 55%, then 45%, then a little gold, then a little yuan, then a lot of caution. This is not ideology. It's risk management. Behind the scenes, the bond market watches too, because the dollar's dominance is tied to demand for U.S. treasuries. When foreign central banks buy treasuries, they fund American deficits. When they buy less, America pays more. Interest is gravity. Even small shifts matter at the scale of trillions. A 1% change in borrowing costs on $30 trillion is not a rounding error. It's a transfer of national wealth. It's hospitals. It's highways. It's the ability to pretend the bill never arrives. Now comes the smoking gun moment. In every financial thriller, there's a meeting, a document, a signature that looks mundane until you realize it's a foreclosure notice. In this story, picture a closed-door summit room. Not grand, just expensive. Dark wood, cold water, translation headsets, a draft agreement sliding across the table like a knife. The language is always polite. Framework, cooperation, settlement mechanism. But what it means is brutal. It means we are building a system where your sanctions don't work. It's a liquidation sale of dependence. In the paraphrased dialogue, the tone is clinical. One side says, we need a unit that doesn't collapse when one currency wobbles. Another says, we need collateral. We need gold. We need proof. Another says, we will not surrender monetary sovereignty. And the ledger, sitting silently in the middle, answers all of them with the same line. Then you must share risk. That's what monetary unions always demand. Shared risk, shared discipline, shared pain. That is why they crack. The euro learned this in 2010. Greece nearly proved that sovereignty can be sold off in austerity tranches. That crisis taught a hard lesson. A shared currency without shared trust becomes a trap. BRICS knows this. That's why the system is framed not as a single currency replacing national money, but as a settlement unit, a tool, a layer, something that can be used without fully merging, a partial marriage. But partial marriages still have divorce lawyers. Now the climax, the default, the moment the money runs out. In classic empire collapses, default is obvious. The treasury can't pay soldiers, bread lines form, currency collapses, riots erupt. This story's default is more subtle. It's not America running out of cash tomorrow. It's the world slowly charging more for the privilege America has enjoyed. It's erosion, not explosion. When demand for dollars softens, the cost of financing debt rises. When the cost rises, budgets tighten. When budgets tighten, politics becomes feral. When politics becomes feral, trust declines. And when trust declines, the ledger punishes you. Sovereignty is solvency. That phrase is not poetry. It's a rule. If you can't fund yourself, you can't choose your future. If you need creditors, you need their approval. If your currency depends on foreign demand, your independence is rented. For developing nations, the consequences are sharper and faster. Many of them carry dollar-denominated debt. When the dollar strengthens or rates rise, their debt service costs swell like an infected wound. They cut subsidies. They cut imports. They cut bread. Hunger is a balance sheet entry. Now imagine those countries watching a new settlement system emerge. A system offering trade without dollar exposure. A system hinting at loans and reserves outside the old orbit. Even if it's imperfect, it becomes leverage, not salvation. Leverage. That is how worlds split. Not by declarations, but by invoices. Countries don't switch sides because they love slogans. They switch because their debt is suffocating them. They switch because the dollar becomes too expensive to breathe. Think about the scale of that. A nation of 100 million people can be steered by an interest rate set in Washington. Not because Washington hates them, because the world's ledger is centralized. BRICS is offering decentralization of power, even if not decentralization of control. And now we reach the part that decides whether this is a historic pivot or a dramatic footnote. Trust, coordination, unity, the soft tissue that holds the skeleton together. BRICS is not a family. It's a room full of rivals who share one enemy: vulnerability. China and India carry border disputes like loaded guns on the table. Russia and China cooperate, but history makes them wary. Brazil's politics swings. South Africa's economy is smaller, its influence fragile. Add new partners and you add new fractures. Any shared monetary system eventually faces the same nightmare scenario: a crisis, a recession, a banking panic. One member's currency collapses. Another member refuses to subsidize them. The settlement unit is stressed. The gold backing is questioned. The ledger starts to bleed. Then come the accusations. Who controls the reserve? Who audits the gold? Who decides weights in the basket? Who gets liquidity support when trade freezes? Those questions are not academic. They are the difference between a stable unit and a currency funeral. Western analysts are betting on this fracture. They're betting that BRICS can build pipes but can't maintain trust, that the system will work in calm weather, then crack in a storm. It's a reasonable bet. History is littered with alliances that couldn't survive the bill, but there's a counterweight. Fear is adhesive. Shared opposition is glue. When nations believe the existing system can be used to freeze them, they tolerate discomfort to build an alternative. Not because they love each other, because the old system terrifies them. That's the psychological fuel. Not ambition, anxiety. So what happens next isn't a Hollywood collapse of the dollar. It's a long, quiet negotiation between systems, a multipolar ledger, different rails for different trades, dollars for some contracts, units for others, euros where trust remains, local currencies where politics demands, a patchwork of power. In that world, the dollar doesn't die. It competes. And competition is the one thing a monopoly fears, because it reveals the true price of the service. The dollar's greatest power was never persuasion. It never had to sell itself. It was assumed, the default setting of the global system. You didn't choose it. You inherited it. What BRICS is attempting is to introduce something any monopoly fears, a choice, and choice forces discipline. If this shift succeeds even partially, the consequences won't fade quickly. Reserve systems don't reset overnight, and payment rails, once built, don't disappear just because tensions cool. Infrastructure almost always outlives politics. If U.S. borrowing costs slowly rise, domestic trade-offs will change. If more global trade moves away from the dollar, sanctions lose their bite. If sanctions weaken, geopolitics reshapes itself. And once those changes harden, the next generation grows up treating them as normal, because children inherit systems, not speeches. In past financial empires, the real bill arrived decades later, and the final payment wasn't dramatic, just symbolic. Here, the final check may not be a single moment, but a realization. U.S. Treasuries are no longer the only unquestioned safe asset. That's the real tension. Global finance isn't a crown, it's a contract, and contracts can be renegotiated, undercut, or replaced. The future won't be decided by speeches or elections, but by reserves, settlement systems, debt schedules, and balance sheets. The war isn't fought with bullets, it's fought with liquidity. And on a quiet night in 2026, BRICS didn't just make headlines. They added a new line to the world's ledger and dared the system to compete.